Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Psychedelics. Today, this is Joe Moore. Today in the show, we have Leoni Joubert. Let me spell that out for you because it's South African. Joubert. Joubert. And she's a South African science writer and has been writing about climate and environmental issues for the last, I think she might have said 20 years. So really engaged in that subject, which is great. Close movement to my heart as well. And yeah, so she got involved in hearing about psychedelics and started becoming a psychedelic writer and activist in South Africa. And we think this is an interesting perspective for our listeners to check out. So even in, non-US or Western Europe countries, you can still make an impact and make a big difference. One major thing I saw is that Dr. David Nutt was hired as a consultant by the South African government to consult on drug harms and rehabilitating their drug penalty or scheduling system, or however you want to call it. So this is a great episode. Kyle and I have a great time talking to Leoni and really want to talk to her again. I really encourage all of you to check out what's happening in South Africa, and if you know some folks there, talk to them and maybe help them understand what's going on and how they could possibly help improve drug laws in South Africa. And we Fan Rousseau, who's a past guest on the show, was great. He's from South Africa and he's living in Canada now. But it was great to hear his perspective on Canada, on Peru, ayahuasca, and medical cannabis in Canada. But we really didn't talk too much about South Africa, what's going on over there. So maybe in the future we'll get him on again. And if you know anybody down there that would be a cool guest, set us up. We'd love to chat with him. Psychedelics Today, email@gmail.com. We'd also just love to hear from you, so hit us up there. Quick moment for shout out for our sponsors. First sponsor I want to mention is Bluebird Botanicals. Bluebird's making great CBD products, and I've been using them for, I think, around a month now. It's been really great. The number one thing I think is I'm able to unwind at the end of the day. A lot of people take like a big bong rip or something. If that's not you and you want to go something a little more low key, try some CBD products by Bluebird Botanicals. It's putting me right to bed, which is cool. CBD is in a precarious legal situation, I guess, where it's really hard to talk about medical claims. So do your own research, dig in. There's plenty of great stuff out there around CBD. So see what you find. Let us know if you have any questions. The company is super ethical. I know 5 to 6 people that are working for the company here in Colorado. It's made using Colorado-grown hemp, organically farmed, or farmed using organic methods. And they actually publish all of their test results on a third party, from a third-party lab on their site. So check it out, bluebirdbotanicals.com. You can check out all that stuff. I think it's wonderful. I really suggest you check it out. Secondly is Entheozen by Transzen. Or let me see if I have that backwards. Entheozen is the company. The product is Transzen. It is really cool. It's a mood enhancement and stress recovery supplement. Kyle and I have been taking it since we've chatted with Caitlin Thompson, who put it together. And it's really cool. I want to read you a few of the ingredients here. One thing you might not know is that drugs metabolize a lot of vitamins and minerals you have in your body. And sometimes you need to eat a lot or find a supplement that helps with that. So check this out. Here's a list of the stuff: B3, B6, B9, B12, magnesium, 5-HTP, mucuna, purines. Let's see what this is. It helps with 5-HTP, and it contains a lot of the amino called L-DOPA, which is quite critical for dopamine production. L-theanine, which looks like it's coming out. It's an amino acid found in green and black tea plants. It may help you increase the levels of serotonin, dopamine, and GABA in the brain, which is pretty helpful. Turmeric, which is just a wonder herb or wonder root, and that helps a lot with inflammation. Spirulina, kind of a single cell algae that has a lot of amino acids, B vitamins in it. Blueberry for antioxidants. Ashwagandha, passion flower, lemon balm, zinc, black pepper. Black pepper can help potentiate the anti-inflammatory effects of turmeric. There's probably some other reasons in there too, but check it out, entheozen.com, and you can find more about what's going on in the Transcend product. So if you want free shipping, entheozen.com/PT, check it out. I like it. In fact, I think I'm almost out, so I got to put in another order. So thanks for reminding me, everybody. All right, so that's it for right now for ads. Just be aware that we're still recruiting folks for our Jamaica workshop, May 16 through 23, legal mushrooms in Jamaica, grown by expert mycologist and facilitator Eric Osborne. And if you want to learn more about that, check out some of our past episodes. They're really great. There's one with Eric Osborne and Shane Moss, who's a comedian who was recently down there facilitating, and he's going back for a second retreat with Eric. And there's another one with Catherine McLean, who helped facilitate down there and came back very impressed with the way Eric operates, and it's very exciting. So I hope you check that out. Again, mycomeditations.com. If you want to learn more, if you want to hit us up, feel free. Psychedelics Today, email@gmail.com. Thank you all, and I hope you enjoy this show with Leoni. Bye. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Today on the show, we have Leoni Joubert. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, nice to meet you guys.
So are you in Cape Town, or I know you're in South Africa?
That's right. Yeah, I'm a science writer based in Cape Town, which is sort of the older city of the country, very beautiful part of the world, and quite an active underground psychedelics community, but self-organizing in a very discreet, private sort of way.
And you have a podcast called The Psychonauts, kind of highlighting a lot of the research that's been coming out. Can you talk a little bit about why you got this started?
So how it all started was a couple of years ago, a woman who lives a very ordinary sort of suburban life, who had been running psychedelic mushroom journeys for sort of ceremonial purposes. She was arrested and charged with dealing in possession of what I think for you is a Schedule 1 or a Class 1 drug. Mm-hmm. Basically, it's like being a dealer of heroin or whatever. She was arrested and charged, and in order to challenge, basically after she was arrested, she decided to challenge the illegality of psilocybin mushrooms on the basis that they're not dangerous, they're not addictive, and that they have huge therapeutic and spiritual potential. So she started a court case that is likely to be heard this year, where she will basically say it's unconstitutional that South Africans don't have access to psilocybin mushrooms. I was interested in this just as a science writer. You know, I've spent the last 17 or so years writing about climate change and food security issues with very much a social justice poverty lens. And I was just interested in the court process of her challenging the laws around this specific substance. But then I also started to look at some of the science that was coming out of the US and Europe and the UK, and thought, this is incredible. You know, if this substance has so much healing potential, so much potential to be integrated into relatively conventional psychotherapeutic methods, surely we should be talking about this here in South Africa. But then in addition to that, as I started researching the story, it was going to be just one single feature article. I discovered this underground psychedelics community where people have been using these substances for years and years, either recreationally or for their own self-actualization or dealing with their own mood disorders. And what was wonderful was, as a science writer, to use this opportunity to use long-form storytelling, just telling the stories of ordinary people to explain how the substance works. Usually I work in the written form. I write books mostly, but in South Africa, because we have very low literacy rates and we have very poor distribution of books, you know, you can spend 2 years writing a book and only 1,000 or 2,000, maybe 3,000 people will read it. Right. So I thought this story was far too important to let it get shoved into the back of a bookshelf. So I thought I would launch into the world of amateur broadcasting, which podcasting allows one to do. Mm-hmm. I think what makes this specific podcast unusual or different is that the way psychedelics work, it's not keeping the substance in your body constantly that allows the antidepressant type qualities to show themselves. It's what happens it's the subjective experience you have while you're in that psychedelic state, which then results in these incredible behavior changes and mood changes that last long after the dosing session. So I wanted to not just talk about the science of how these substances work or how psilocybin works, but actually talk about the subjective experience that people have, to show how the incredible way that the brain works with the substance, or the substance with the brain, in order to help people resolve some of their big stuff. It's been quite a remarkable journey.
Yeah. How's it been going so far? Is it like widely accepted, or have you been noticing a lot of listeners in the South Africa region?
There is a small there's a small listenership. People who are receptive to it are loving it. A lot of people are still very closed off to the idea. I'm really surprised that, given I'm essentially putting free content out there, that the local broadcasting industry has not picked up on this. I've had a few interviews with local press, a few print articles, and one or two interviews on radio, but that's about it. And I don't know if it's because people are very, very cautious about going there, or South Africa's, we're way behind you, both sort of ideologically, culturally around the substances, but also in terms of podcasts. Podcasting, we have a very fast-growing audience for podcasts. Most of the content is coming from Europe and the US. We have very, very few people who are producing podcasts locally. So I think it's going to take a bit of time to get going. But once the court process happens around this attempt to legalize or decriminalize psilocybin, then I think there'll be a lot of media opportunity to push it a little bit further.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it's a great podcast. I think I listened to maybe 3 or 4 episodes when when we first connected. And I really like the story format. It's such a different take on it in this psychedelic community. And I think it's really great what you're doing. Can we dive in a little bit and talk about what's happening in South Africa and like what the underground scene is like over there? And
okay. So the underground scene is mostly, I would say, a very middle-class community. It's a community that identifies with the sort of more Western European culture. It's a community that does a lot of the trans-party scene. Outside of that community, psychedelics aren't used widely in communities that are more identified with the traditional African cultures. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there. I think it's quite easy to take people who remember what the 60s were like. They remember the flower power generation. Even if they've never tried any of these substances, it's not anathema to them. How one would get psychedelics used outside of that community, in the more African cultures, I'm not sure. That would be interesting to explore. We do have a very long history of cannabis use, so that's not unusual. But getting it outside of the recreational scene, this very small little recreational group, and getting therapists to start thinking about its potential and to start reading up on the science that's coming from abroad, and then thinking about ways to move it from where it is at the moment in the sort of closet space into a more widely used cultural space is going to be another challenge.
I heard there was substantial, this is from Hamilton Morris's Pharmacopoeia, substantial Quaalude use in some of the really poor communities. Have you heard of this?
No, I haven't.
Do you know Quaaludes? It's like I'm going to do a really bad job here, but it was like...
maybe what I could talk a little bit on, which is where I feel more comfortable talking, is a couple of the ideas that we're batting around here in a very small group of people about how to bring together some of the models for the therapeutic use of psychedelics that are being used informally and formally in the US and Europe with the South African context. But maybe just to step back a little bit, what makes this issue feels so important for me. A lot of the writing that I do is around people who are born into contexts of very, very severe poverty. And I found an interesting and really tragic piece of research that came out of an informal settlement just outside Johannesburg. So Johannesburg is the heart of the economic engine room of South Africa. Hundreds of years of mining, of very exploitative capitalist mining of a labor class. Around these cities, you have these enormous slum developments, either people living in really low-cost formal housing or often in informal sort of shanty-type shacks. We have incredibly high levels of unemployment, poor literacy rates, high alcohol use and abuse, lots of domestic violence, etc. Recently, some civil society organizations and a school of public health in Johannesburg went into one of these communities, an informal settlement called a slum environment called Diepsloot. That's an Afrikaans word meaning deep gully. And it's a community where there are very, very high levels of gender-based violence. So basically men harming women. So these researchers did an interview with about just under 3,000 men to try and understand the extent of violence towards women, but also the roots of violence towards women. And what they found is that just over 50%, so now just over half of the men they interviewed, they had either raped or assaulted a woman in the year leading up to the interview session. And most of them had done so more than once. And when they tried to drill down to understand why men were so violent towards women, strangers and people in their families, they found that almost all of these men had been really violently abused as children, not just sort of physically or sexually. You know, we're not just talking about being bullied at school or beaten up by a drunken father, but also what I've come to term the passive violence of poverty. So the stress and trauma to that child's immune system by being constantly afraid of just living in fear, not knowing where your food is going to come from. You know, these are communities where you don't have running water in the home. So their mums will have to go to a communal outhouse about 200 meters from the home at night. And there are often murders and terrible rapes that happen, you know, at night around people just going to use the loo. So, and, you know, you look at work by someone like Dr. Joubert, you know, where he makes these very strong links between childhood trauma and adult onset mood disorders, substance abuse, antisocial behavior, etc. So when I saw that research and realized the extent to which South Africans live in constant fear of hunger and constant fear of murder and constant fear of just deprivation, how you understand then why you have such high levels of mood disorders and substance abuse amongst adults. So I started to think, and sorry, these are also communities that have almost no access to public mental health, zero access to private mental health, which is hugely expensive, and I'm sure it is for you as well. So I started to think, you know, surely if you look at some of the models that are being used in the US and Canada, for instance, where is it veterans for entheogenic therapy?
Yep.
They're doing some of this work, and Joubert is also doing very similar work. We're taking people in to do communal or group sessions, several days of ayahuasca treatment, and then often with the vets, they're doing sort of a year-long integration therapy afterwards. So it's a relatively low-cost way of rolling out. It's a relatively low-cost way of rolling out therapy to a large group of people. So I was thinking, and of course, the other model, which you're very familiar with, is what the Imperial College London and the Johns Hopkins guys are using, where they're putting people through 12-week therapy sessions where it's mostly talk therapy with just 2 dosing sessions in between. So to integrate those models here in South Africa, you know, for a really affordable amount of money in terms of paying for the psilocybin, you could train up social workers, nurses, even counselors and lay counselors in churches, for instance. You could train these people up on how to hold psychedelic processes. It's not hard to do. You just need experience. Mm-hmm. And working alongside trained therapists to then bring in groups of people at very, very low cost, put them through group therapy sessions, group dosing sessions, and then work with other civil society organizations afterwards to help them integrate. You know, what the vets for entheogenic therapy are doing is using sort of equine therapy or canine therapy in a year following the treatment. That may not be culturally appropriate in some of these contexts, but you could start up soccer clubs and carpentry clubs and crocheting clubs, you know, where men and women can do sort of things after the therapy process. And, you know, with the cost of dried mushrooms on the street here, those dosing sessions would cost, I don't know, less than $60. Obviously, you know, if it's a more regulated market, you're going to be using the lab synthesized psilocybin, and it'll be much more expensive and much more controlled. But given how relatively benign and safe psilocybin is in a dried mushroom form, you can pretty much, if the laws are loosened up sufficiently so that it's not a tightly regulated substance, then, you know, you could probably use dried mushrooms safely, very, very cheaply. And you could start a whole fantastic little side industry of growing mushrooms
Yeah, definitely. I don't know if you listened to our episode with this guy, Eric Osborne. He has a retreat center down in Jamaica called Myco Meditations, and he pretty much does that. They use dried mushrooms encapsulated at like half a gram per capsule. They pretty much just do like lots of kind of group sessions. And
Okay.
so,
Oh, yes, that's interesting. And sorry, I should have actually mentioned that earlier. In the psychedelic community here in South Africa, there are there aren't many people who do this, but I'm starting to collect a database of those who are, who do these very deliberate mushroom journeys, which are very much built on the similar sort of ayahuasca type process, very shamanic in its holding. And people will take anything from 2 grams of mushrooms up to the hero's dose, 5 grams, and then will do their journey through the course of a night in small groups, always with experienced sitters, and then one sort of more experienced person overseeing the whole process. And I mean, these are people who've got lots of experience. They could work very effectively alongside conventional therapists so that they can share each other's skills and learn from one another, and then slowly begin to integrate this into conventional therapy.
I'm glad you're looking at this group thing and that people are paying attention to it, because I think that is part of the future here. Like perhaps people with very acute trauma need one-on-one work, but for the most part, people should be able to function in a group. And in fact, with our experience with holotropic breath work, the group is a huge portion of the healing. So being in group helps quite a bit. There's a lot to be said there. So I'm really happy to hear all that.
Yeah. Yeah, I just hope that our medical community starts to seriously pay attention, because we have a window of opportunity. I mean, what we're hearing from the States is that MDMA and psilocybin-assisted therapy could be licensed for medical use in 3 to 5 years, which means it will come to South Africa, because that's just the nature of globalization and the drugs industry. So we have an opportunity to start training people up now. And I mean, the bottom line is, if you're going to be a trained therapist or psychedelic facilitator, you have to have experience in the substance yourself. It's just a part of the deal. So, we need to find ways for therapists to legally begin playing with this stuff and experimenting and learning how to use it, so that when it comes to South Africa, they're geared up and they're good to go.
Yeah, and MAPS actually includes that into their therapy training protocol, where the therapist will go take a dose and placebo dose of MDMA, part of the training, which is pretty cool. That they were able to incorporate that into the training. But something else is like coming up for me too. I worked in the kind of the peer support world, and it seems like a relatively low cost way of supporting people, and pretty significant outcome, because it's not like you don't have that authority kind of saying I'm the expert. It's just peers with lived experience just supporting one another. And I could probably see something like that take up in the psychedelic communities. I mean, if you think something like the Zendo project, where you have these peers helping people kind of navigate their difficult experience at a festival or whatever.
And in fact, I'm glad you mentioned that, because the Zendo crew have been out to South Africa to do some training. So obviously you have Burning Man in the States. South Africa has one of the regionals. It's called Africa Burn. And in fact, it's the largest regional in the world of the sort of burn. I don't want to say franchise, it's the wrong word, but you know what I mean. So we have, that was a terrible word, sorry. But so the Zendo project, they came out and did a lot of work with our, a lot of the harm reduction work with volunteers out here. So there is a nice base of individuals who are keen to learn more of these skills. But it's very small. It's very small. And how we sort of scale that up sufficiently, that's going to require a lot of, I think, communications to just dull some of the hysteria that still surrounds the topic.
Yeah.
Could you speak with us a little bit about the Ibogaine law? In one of your emails, you mentioned that it was unscheduled up until very recently.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. So as you probably know, when the 1971 UN Convention on Psychotropic Substances came into being, psilocybin was put on that. Obviously, peyote was on there, and LSD, a couple of other things. For some reason, so then because South Africa is a signatory, those are therefore banned substances in South Africa, illegal, and they're listed alongside heroin and crystal meth, etc. For some reason, Ibogaine, which, as your listeners will probably know, is a West African psychedelic that has been used extensively to work very effectively with addiction, particularly opiate addiction. for some reason in South Africa, it hasn't found its way onto the illegal substances listing. So it was being used not widely, but a few rehab clinics here were using it to treat addictions. Anyway, the Medicines Control Council decided that it should be scheduled because there is obviously this well-documented risk of coronary problems for people who have heart trouble. So the Registrar of Medicines scheduled it. And in 2016, it was listed as a Schedule 6 drug, which essentially here means that it can be prescribed by doctors for a medical context, which was interesting because given how the state regards other psychedelics, you would have thought it would have been banned alongside all the others. So I think that this could possibly set a precedent where we could argue to the state that the state is already willing to consider a form of psychedelic-assisted therapy with Ibogaine. So why not let's also consider these other substances? And obviously the strictness of the scheduling needs to be commensurate with the potential harm of the substance. So obviously Ibogaine has a much higher risk rate, I think, than the other psychedelics. So a Schedule 6 listing is probably necessary. But psilocybin, for instance, or LSD or MDMA are so benign, relatively speaking, that they should have a much lower listing. So they're not heavily restricted. The problem with psilocybin becoming a Schedule 6 substance means that it would be very tightly controlled by the pharmaceuticals industry. It would become very expensive. It would become as inaccessible and unaffordable as the current treatments are for depression and anxiety and PTSD. So one wants to avoid that. You know, it's a little bit like cannabis. If cannabis really does have some of the therapeutic potential that it looks like it has, and it's so relatively benign, then, you know, people should have much more affordable access to it. Similar as you have to access nicotine or alcohol in this country, it should be not necessarily available alongside your broccoli and your culinary mushrooms, but maybe in the down at the pharmacy section.
And are there a lot of doctors like working with Ibogaine in South Africa then, if it's like if they can prescribe it?
No, there are not many. There's one doctor in Cape Town. His name is Simon Loxton, I think. He does work with. He's founded an organization. Oh man, I'm sorry, I can't find the name now. He's founded an Ibogaine association. He has been using Ibogaine for a while in his rehab clinic here in Cape Town, literally 5 minutes from where I live. And he has mentioned to me that he has started clinical trials. I'm waiting to sit with him and do a formal interview and find out a little bit more. So I don't know whether he's working with a medical institution in South Africa to do these trials or outside of the country. But that's a very significant development. And this small body of psychiatrists and psychologists that I'm talking with about possibly starting a bit of an activist movement within the medical community. If we can point to Simon Loxton's work and say, look, clinical trials have started in the Ibogaine area, then it could get some interest. But incidentally, and this is purely an anecdote, but I was phoning around very recently when I was trying to follow up on the Ibogaine story. I phoned a rehab clinic, and when I mentioned that I wanted to find out more information about Ibogaine as a form of psychedelic-assisted therapy, the person I was on the phone with literally went from being friendly and cordial and full of information to saying, "Thank you, that's it," and pretty much hung up. He said,
"Wow,
conventional psychotherapy is still the most effective way for treating addictions," and that was it. I mean, he almost hung up on me. So I was just interested at the level of emotionality that came through in that exchange. And it does show that we have a huge communications job ahead of us to try and get people to think more openly.
That's great. And there's another part there about possibly being able to, once this Ibogaine stuff progresses, bolting on maybe policy improvements around mushrooms and LSD. So that would be really neat too.
Mm. What would you mean by a policy improvement? I'm just trying to think how that would fit into our context.
Prohibition. So
okay,
how do we remove them from the scheduling scenario? Similar to what you were talking about earlier, special stores perhaps selling them or something. Perhaps you need a pilot's license before you buy them or something like that. But
yeah,
who knows?
And and obviously because when you take a big dose, which is what is required for a therapeutic intervention, as you all know, it has to be done with the right set and setting. It has to be in a contained, safe space with the right music, preferably. So how does the state put something in place where, okay, so you go to your pharmacy and you get your 5 grams of psilocybin, dried mushrooms, but at the same time, you're not going home and just slicking it. Sorry, that's the Afrikaans word for swallowing it at home on your own. And then you could end up having a horrible experience, or not even a horrible or difficult trip, but you won't get the most benefit. And I mean, this is the thing that I'm finding a little bit frustrating, because I have had quite a few people contact me to say that they want to try a big dose session. And every single time I say, do not do this on your own. Find an experienced guide to sit with you. And I still have a few people get hold of me and say, well, they went and tried it anyway. You know, I point out to them that it's not just that there is this risk of having a really difficult experience, but they're actually depriving themselves the opportunity of maximizing the benefit. Mm-hmm. Because when you are in the right space with the right music and also with the right group, the gains are just extraordinary and really, really big. But there's always someone out there that wants to get a little bit cocky and try it on their own.
Something that just popped in my mind was we were talking to a psychiatrist who does ketamine work, and he actually prescribes like oral doses to take home after working with people for a while, and he knows that safety and trust is there. So I mean, that could also kind of be a model where you work with somebody in person at first, kind of get your pilot's license or license to do this stuff, and then once that trust is built, knowing that that person could have a sitter at home and then kind of engage in that work on their own.
Is that psychiatrist in the States or outside
He
the
is.
States?
Yeah, in Colorado.
Oh, there's a number of
That's
them too.
great.
Dr. Phil Wolfson, who wrote the recent or co-edited the recent ketamine papers. He'll also do oral lozenges. And the other guy was Dr. Scott Shannon in Colorado.
Okay. That's very encouraging to hear. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of encouraging things happening. It's really incredible to see it moving along. Like,
yeah.
Are you seeing engagement at all in the psychedelic work with the very poor communities? Like, are they willing? Okay, so not interested.
No.
Addiction.
No.
Is okay.
I think that we're very far away from getting to the point where we actually even start talking about integrating this kind of therapy into those communities. All I can say, I don't have the figures in front of me, and I won't sort of dump loads of numbers on you, but the extent of alcohol misuse and abuse in this country is absolutely staggering. The link with road deaths, with domestic violence, with all sorts of emergency admissions over weekends, the rates of alcohol, the downstream impact of alcohol use and misuse here is absolutely staggering. So there really is a huge potential to bring this kind of therapy into those communities where people are so at risk and are so vulnerable. But unfortunately, as you know, there are also lots of other problematic substances. For instance, crystal meth, what we call tick here in South Africa, is incredibly cheap, very accessible, and really just destroys communities. So there is this assumption that, if psilocybin is in the same category as crystal meth, then it must be as dangerous and therefore much, much, much worse than alcohol. So that's going to need a lot of work on the communication side. Yeah. But sorry, yes, just one point that I would really like to see happen here in Cape Town. For some reason reasons that are too complex to go into right now, the crystal meth issue in the slum environments just outside Cape Town, very, very severe problem. Now, if we could take Simon Loxton's model, where he's doing the clinical trials very near here with Ibogaine, if we could start doing that kind of work with people in poorer communities where you have very severe crystal meth problems, that would also be a potential for really groundbreaking work. And there are a number of significant academic and state institutions that have the right sort of infrastructure, whether it's the institution or the funding models, the right medical ethical parameters, perfectly placed to start doing trials in that context. I just we need to have the right conversations with the right academics to get them thinking about it.
That'd be fascinating.
What kind of pushback are you seeing on the academic front? Or are people willing to engage in these conversations, or are they?
It's a bit premature to say. I've been really fortunate in that I've been able to touch base with a few medical people who are very open-minded. Some of them are as excited as I am about the potential to get other medical people involved. Others are so cautious because they have seen the resistance from their peers that they just think there's no point in even trying. It's really very, very early days. I would love to have this conversation with you again in 5 years' time and be able to report back, something really constructive. I think what needs to happen is a small sort of activist initiative that starts a whole lot of informal conversations within the medical community and then slowly sort of ramp it up, get some formal clinical trials on the go, and then a proper drive to destigmatize. I mean, I'm just fascinated at how quickly the conversation has changed in the past 2 years, looking at the strong communications drive coming from organizations like MAPS, the Imperial College team, the Johns Hopkins team. Good, solid communication from there has changed the conversation. I mean, I'm just staggered at how many popular press articles there are around this issue. So if we could, we may be 5-10 years behind you, but hopefully we'll come galloping along.
Are there any small little groups like here in the States? There's been all these little psychedelic groups kind of popping up, and in California, Oregon, Colorado, and now Vermont, there's these kind of little groups that are forming initiatives to try and get psilocybin legal. Are there any kind of psychedelic groups popping up in South Africa to
Very
advocate?
few. Yeah, no, very few. And in fact, it's interesting because I've been following the guys in Oregon who are doing a lot of advocacy work. I've been following that through social media. So what is happening in South Africa? There's a small community of quite almost devoted followers around the woman who was arrested. Her name is Monica Kromhout. She has a small but very dedicated group of supporters. And they often sort of self-organize via social media. So they stay in communication via social media. We're not yet at the stage where people are organizing talks and evening discussions the way I see coming through on social media from the US platforms all the time. And London as well, people getting together for post-psychedelic integration discussions and that sort of thing. What's happening here is very, very below the radar. People are trying to be very discreet still, and it's small. But what is there is good. There's some experienced psychonauts in that community, and some of them are also therapists and psychiatrists and medical doctors. So there is a good solid sort of community that's slowly beginning to grow. I think the main thing is it's just so risky to go public. I mean, even myself as a science writer, I was incredibly anxious about launching this podcast. I decided to do this as very much a self-funded, not-for-profit initiative. So I haven't earned a penny on the podcast, but it has taken about as much time as if I'd written this as one of my normal books. Mm-hmm. But I realized that going it alone like this, there was a huge risk of reputational damage. In the States, you've got someone like Michael Pollan, who, I mean, it's interesting. There's such a parallel in our work because he's been writing about food security issues for years, and so have I, just in very different contexts. And then we both suddenly end up writing about the psychedelic thing at the same time. I mean, he's got a book coming out in a couple of months. But, I mean, I noticed he's very outspoken about the fact that he's done a number of psychedelic experiences. He doesn't necessarily say if he's still doing them or still using, although that's a controversial term. But, he feels safe enough in that context to go public and say, I've been through a number of these experiences and this is what the science is saying, etc. You will find very few South Africans who will publicly state that they have or continue to utilize this substance.
Hey, everybody, Joe here. This podcast is brought to you by Entheozen. We want to feature their product, TransZen. It is great, and I've been taking it daily for a while now. I think it's a wonderful product, and we want to have more of you guys try it out. We've partnered with them to get you free shipping, so check them out at entheozen.com/PT to get your Psychedelics Today free shipping offer.
So coming out is a big issue. Do you see any other huge roadblocks to get anything rolling?
Yeah, in fact, that's a good point. So I mentioned in one of the previous emails in our communications that we have a big cannabis ruling about to come back. So the highest court in the land, the Constitutional Court, is being asked to consider whether the current laws that make cannabis illegal are unconstitutional. What happened is a plaintiff basically sued the state on the basis that they were now being criminalized because of the substance being criminalized, and the state was now defending its case, saying that cannabis should remain illegal. A very ideologically conservative group whose foundation is in the evangelical right decided to join with the state against the cannabis, what is being called the dacha couple. Dacha is the local word for cannabis. So this group is called Doctors for Life. They are anti-abortion. And they're incredibly well funded. So we have concern that they will also join with the state in the psilocybin case. We're hoping that they might have run out of steam and run out of resources, but I think that's unlikely. So we were incredibly lucky. I think that most of the judges who heard the cannabis case are progressive. They understand the difference between science-based evidence and ideology. And apparently in the cannabis case, they gave the Doctors for Life legal team hell just by really challenging them. So
Nice.
So let's hope that that doesn't become a hurdle. We have been extremely fortunate. So Professor David Nutt, who I'm sure all of your listeners will be familiar with, David came out to testify around the scientific evidence surrounding cannabis. He was here last year for that case. And he has been hired by Monica Kromhout's legal team to put together a full report on the scientific basis for psilocybin. So, and he will be flown, if the court case happens this year, he'll be flown out to South Africa and he'll testify here again. So, if anyone is going to make a really strong, good case for the medical use of this substance and its relatively benign nature, then it'll be him.
That's a huge win. I've never heard of that happening before. And I don't even think people outside of South Africa know about that. That's extraordinary. Because the fact that they're not taking the British government's word for just how he was discredited there is a huge win. And then the fact that this non-UK government is leveraging him is wonderful. Let's hope that's replicated elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
So what do you think some key steps people in South Africa could take to shift the conversation a little bit? Is it really that dangerous to come out? Like, will you go to jail or get beaten?
I don't think it's that risky from a use perspective. So I think looking at how the police have handled the Monica Kromhout situation, it's very clear that a lot of the police had never heard of psilocybin mushrooms before stumbling upon her. Someone had to point out the fact that this thing was in the law books. But they evidently realized very quickly that they're not dealing with a heroin kingpin. So they've been incredibly gentle with her, which I think is positive. I think what needs to happen, and maybe this is me just taking it a little bit too personally, but I'm surprised that the local medical journalism community has not jumped onto this because it's such an easy story. It's such an interesting story. All this material is coming through on a daily basis, and yet the South African medical writers are not jumping on it. So I'm not entirely sure what that's about. Whether they think it's just a bizarre little hippie story on the side, if they're not really taking it seriously. But I'm just every time I send out, I'm trying to use Twitter and Facebook, but mostly Twitter as a way of keeping information going through to the local media. Hopefully they will eventually pick up on it. And I think that once the court trial, the court date is set, then I think the local media will pick up. And once the science writers in South Africa pick up on it, then I think the conversation will gain a lot of momentum. So I think what I need to do is make sure that I have a lot of material ready to go when the press pick up on it, and then also make sure that there are some psychiatrists and psychologists out there that are willing to be interviewed formally. So maybe there are a few behind the scenes conversations that should happen with them to say, look, journalists are going to start phoning you in the next few months. Get yourselves ready.
Are you familiar with any kind of philanthropist in South Africa might be willing to fund movements?
Well, interestingly enough, Open Society is the Open Society Foundation would be a possible source of support. I know that they have put a lot of effort and money behind the general harm reduction advocacy movement in South Africa. They incidentally funded one of my books a few years ago, which is looking at food security. So that might be a relationship that's worth leveraging. But they definitely do have a slightly liberal position on drugs and drug policy, and understand that a harm reduction focus is a smarter way of dealing with drug issues in a country. So it might be worth sitting down with the local office and seeing what they have to say.
And there's no doctors right now that are coming out in South Africa publicly in support.
That's not entirely true. I've seen 3 or 4 names in the press of people who've been willing to be interviewed on the subject. Of course, no one is going to say that they recommend using the substance. They'll all say, get screened. They all take the harm reduction line, which is the responsible thing to do. We know that you're probably going to try this. If you are, get yourself screened first. If you are going to do it, make sure you know what the substances are, what the dosage is, do it in the right safe space. So there's a small handful of those who will do that. But yeah, people are very cautious. And, I know some doctors who use these substances recreationally and have to be incredibly careful about who sees them where and in what context.
Right. I imagine Africa burn is kind of tricky for a lot of those folks because they're like, it's a relatively small country in a lot of ways. And if you're doing a burn like that, there's a good chance somebody would know you.
Yeah. You've got 13,000 people together in a very large campsite, a small desert for a week. And, lots of cameras. That's one of the things, so it's hard to be invisible these days in those kinds of spaces. Yeah.
In your email, you said there is a legal team kind of presenting psilocybin in the next year or so.
Yes.
Right?
So that's so Monica Cromhout, who's the woman who was arrested. She's, I think, 72 or 73 years old now. Her legal team is the one that's putting together this case that will take to our High Court to basically say psilocybin is not as dangerous and addictive as the law says it is. It has great therapeutic and recreational potential, and that South Africans should have a constitutional right to access it. This is the legal team that has been in contact with Professor David Nutt, and they had to fundraise quite significantly to pay for David's time to put the report together. But apparently it's a pretty substantial document that makes a good, solid case for an evidence-based case for the therapeutic potential of psilocybin. So that team is basically sitting and waiting to hear what's going to happen on the cannabis case. So we're in a little bit of limbo.
Gotcha.
So the Constitutional Court will come back in the next 2 months and make a ruling on the cannabis case and decide how to progress. If they come back and say, yes, it's unconstitutional that cannabis is illegal and that for, basically rights to privacy, you should be able to use this substance in your home as long as it's not hurting anyone else. If the Constitutional Court makes that ruling, then this legal team will say, you've already set a precedent for cannabis. Now let's do something similar for psilocybin. Here's the evidence to show that psilocybin is even safer than cannabis. So all the more reason to not just decriminalize, but actually legalize.
That's great. And I think that's kind of similar to how things have kind of been unfolding here, first like decriminalization and then, medical decriminalization and legalization. Now all this psychedelic stuff is starting to come out. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds in the next few months to the year.
And it's
over there.
Yeah, and it's so interesting to see. For instance, California, is already starting to show what profits it's getting from taxes. I think on cannabis.
Colorado,
so
as well.
If you have,
it's huge. The amount of money is incredible. It's really helpful.
So if you think, yeah, okay. So now, if you think, California is the 7th largest economy in the world. It used to be the 6th. Now, if such a big economy is taking this relatively progressive step with regards to the substance, it's only a matter of time before it starts to trickle through to other places.
Absolutely. I totally agree. Do you see, the one question I've had for a long time is, we have like the US, the UK, and a number of countries in Europe and Israel doing psychedelic research. And I'm wondering, is it really required that the individual country do all the research, or could they leverage another country's research in order to inform policy decisions?
I think it's useful to have a bit of both. I think, given the developing world context is so different to the developed world context, both in terms of cultural attitudes towards substances, in terms of the socioeconomic and political situations that people find themselves in, it's so different. Someone living in a slum outside Johannesburg has a very different world experience than someone living in a slum outside London, for instance, if there even is such a thing in London. So I do think there is. I think it's necessary to build your case on the science emerging from abroad, and then contextualize it here. I mean, I wish I could take you on a drive through my city and introduce you to some of the communities that I'm talking about to give you a sense of how different the context is. I think for me, the main thing is this country has such a tragic history of race-based domination and mistreatment and dehumanization. And there are a lot of people through, because of our apartheid history and the terrible economic policies and segregation policies that went with that, people have been dehumanized for way too long. And, even though everyone is now equal in front of the law, the economic structure that has kept people in poverty for decades is still there. And that's where so much of this brokenness comes from. And that's why I feel so strongly about this. If this is such an affordable way to bring people, it's not a silver bullet, but it's a small way of intervening in very broken lives to bring about some level of healing for people who otherwise have nothing, no help.
It'd be really interesting to see how that would shift the communities around. I think there's major potential for psychedelics and like all this trauma work. And I think there's some folks in the States working on that specifically with like race-based trauma with MDMA therapy, or they want to get a pilot study going.
Okay. Well, if you could, if you have a link to that, I would love to read up more about that. I have seen trials or the suggestion of a trial for working with people with HIV. So obviously you're aware of the work with cancer and terminal illness diagnoses and work with the psilocybin around that. And I've seen that someone's doing work with HIV patients as well and AIDS patients. So we have very, very high levels of HIV here. So that would be another interesting opportunity to integrate. You also
saw that one in the States that's happening?
I think it was in the States. Yeah, I must go and look. It was months ago that I saw this, but I mean, there's so much potential,
Young researcher Gabby Hagen-Liebes was on our show. She was part of the NYU team. Now she's over in California, and she is actually putting together a tiny study or helping out a study. I forget where she's at. UCLA, maybe. Sorry if that's not right.
No. I'll go and Google it. Thank you.
Yeah, but she's actually they're working on an AIDS study in group session, which is really interesting. San Fran, yeah.
Yeah, because and also, I mean, it would be interesting to see work done with people who end up with sort of serious spinal injuries. The emotional trauma of having to learn to live with and work with a body that no longer functions the way it used to. That level of depression can be very challenging. So it would be interesting to see work done in that area too.
Are you seeing folks from South Africa travel to places like Peru or other places with interesting drug laws in order to skirt laws?
Yes. So there's a small community of quite devoted ayahuasca following. So ayahuasca's actually treatments are offered here in South Africa. There are a few people who, I'm not sure how they get hold of the material. Some grow it. Some, must ship it in. I'm not sure. I know that some people do grow it. And there are locals who have been trained up in the sort of shamanic processes. But every now and then they will bring in traditional shamans from sort of Peru, for instance. But I also know quite a few who've been to Peru and specifically had the experience there. Again, because it's so expensive for South Africans to travel abroad like that, it's a really small handful. But the local ayahuasca community is also growing. In fact, I would say it's significantly bigger than the psilocybin community. That is a little bit of a guess, but I would say it is, yeah. But I mean, the lovely thing is that both processes require very, very similar skills. So, there's sort of overlap. Most people who've tried ayahuasca have tried psilocybin.
It would be interesting, too, to maybe even explore something that's totally legal, like breath work. There's actually somebody from South Africa that reached out to us about breath work facilitators in the South African region. I really didn't have too much to offer, but maybe to come to the States or whatnot. But I think they might have found somebody down there, but I don't know.
Okay.
Have you personally
I know
tried
one.
holotropic breath work?
I haven't. No. In fact, I am curious to try, but I also not sure if I'm patient enough. I can barely sit for a 10-minute meditation in the morning. So to actually do a breathwork session that actually gets me to an altered state, I don't know if I'd have the patience.
The
but
group
all the more
really
reason
helps
to
a
try.
lot. You don't
Does
need
it?
it's a I feel like it's a substantially easier thing to get into than a regular meditation practice. Thankfully, it's only one time.
Okay.
And you have people there supporting you, and the music is incredible.
Okay. I am fascinated, though, and this is an area that I know very little about, and I hope to learn more, but I am fascinated that a physical technique can bring about the same altered state as taking a substance like psilocybin. I mean, it's just bizarre to me that one's brain can work in that way, but it does. So I'm very curious to learn more. I should go and do a session.
I just did a mini session yesterday, and somebody asked, they're like, "Were you walking around with the strobe light?" Because I just kept seeing all these flashes. Like, no, I did not have a strobe light walking around. But yeah, it's funny. They were surprised. Like, really? That was just me? I was like, yeah. Like,
I just ran a short one too. It's not too common. I run short sessions. Usually they're about 3 hours or a full day workshop. But in this 1 hour session I ran the other day, somebody had visions of becoming a lion and immediately into a whale in the ocean swimming around. So like really, really connecting with that. Like it was almost as if they were actually those animals. It's very interesting.
Wow, that's extraordinary. And I mean, just mentioning sort of animals the way you do has reminded me of, I think, why for me the psychedelics experience needs to become a lot more mainstream. I've spent the last 17 years or so writing about climate change. And for most of that time, my feeling was that the worst sort of manifestations of climate change would happen after I was dead. Wouldn't really matter for me anymore. And now we've had several years of really extreme weather events across the globe, and which highlight that actually we're a lot further down the road than we realized. And we need a sort of a post-capitalist, community-oriented response to take care of ourselves, each other, and the environment. And if psychedelics are a way to reconnect with our community, to grow empathy and reconnect with the environment, then we absolutely have got to get this substance out there. I mean, I'm just interested in how many people have told me that they have felt almost an ideological shift in themselves. People who previously would have seen themselves as politically conservative now are leaning towards the left and are now recycling and taking care of animals and that sort of thing. And that was before, you started to see papers coming out of the Imperial College group saying, that psychedelics might be able to help deal with totalitarianism. And anyway, interesting.
Cool. So we're coming up to about an hour. I'm just curious if there's anything else you want to throw out that we may not have touched yet.
No, I think we've pretty much covered all the ground. I think what I would really just like to say is thank you to the two of you for reaching out to us. We really are a small, isolated, very quiet, self-organized community, and it's going to be like this for a while still. So being able to connect with you where you are safer and more supported, it's a little bit like having a nice sort of umbilical cord back to the mothership in a way. We don't feel like we're quite so isolated. So thanks very much for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, really excited to see the work expanding globally, and that it's not just over here, because it's going to take, the States aren't the cleanest political government, and it's going to take a while. And it's going to take international improvements and development for us to also clean up our act. So really excited to play a part of it.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was listening to a podcast recently, and I've just gone blank on who was speaking, but he was saying how the US, one of the worst exports from the United States is the war on drugs.
Yeah.
But one of the better potential exports is the fact that the FDA is such a highly regarded regulatory body that what happens in the FDA is going to also become an export. When the FDA then decides that MDMA is a breakthrough medical technology, the rest of the world's going to pay attention. So that's a good move.
Yeah, I'm really excited about it. And that's a great point. I do agree with you there, because it's a extremely hard-nosed science, maybe sometimes influenced by money, but for the most part, science is going to win out over time. It's just a matter of staying on top of it, keeping producing good science, and science writers like yourself, podcasters like yourself and us, like we just need to keep doing it and hopefully shift the conversation. Could you give out your website address?
Yes. So it's the podcast is called The Psychonauts. It's just psychonauts.co.za. So the South African sort of end of the URL is .co.za. You can also find it through iTunes. You need to search for The Psychonauts, otherwise you won't find it. But yeah, just search either for Leoni Joubert or psychonauts.co.za and you'll find it. And thanks so much for the support. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. And people can also follow you on Twitter, right? That's actually how we connected.
In fact, you're right. So it's at P_NAUTS. That's my Twitter handle. And on Facebook is The Psychonauts. And yeah, good luck with your work. I think you're doing amazing stuff over there. And, you know, the genie is out of the bottle on your side of the Atlantic. It's we'll be a few years behind you.
All right. Well, hopefully we can support you in that.
Thanks.
Hey, everybody. Hope you enjoyed that. Joe Moore here. That was really fun to learn more about what's going on in South Africa, and that there really are some interesting hopes for a place like South Africa that isn't necessarily known for having a progressive government. So let's keep an eye on that. And, I kind of want to get down to South Africa to see what's going on in person in a lot of ways. Perhaps do some breath work down there, or maybe a psychedelics conference. Doesn't sound like they've had one, best I can tell. So perhaps that would be cool. Anyway, another thanks to our sponsors, Bluebird Botanicals. The product I've been taking lately is Hemp Classic 6X concentrated. It's really nice. CBD products, you don't get high, which is nice, but there's a lot of benefits. I can't really tell you about them here due to some federal interventions, but it's cool. Check it out, bluebird.botanicals.com. There's also a whole bunch of research if you wanted to do your own digging. Just, search around for stuff on CBD and the endocannabinoid system, and you'll find some good stuff. There's no promises, and I don't want to say that I don't want to get myself in trouble with the federal government here in the States, so I'm not going to say too much more. And just so you know, this is available for mail order to any state in the U.S. except for South Dakota. Yeah, only for the U.S. So if you're in Canada, sorry, but you might actually have your own CBD company that you could go to in Canada. But I'm sure Bluebird's working on figuring out how to ship internationally. So more soon on that. Thanks also to Caitlin Thompson of Entheozen. Product is called TransZen. It's a mood enhancement and stress support supplement. It's very awesome, and Kyle and I have been using it for a while. The intro, you heard me mention a lot of stuff. There's a whole bunch of B vitamins, magnesium, 5-HTP, various herbs and amino acids, turmeric, spirulina, blueberry, ashwagandha. I've had that in a few different fruit smoothies, and it's pretty cool. Passion flower, lemon balm, zinc, and black peppers. Yeah, so all sorts of stuff in there that's really great for you. Fills in some nutritional gaps. Will also help you recover from situations where maybe you partied a little too hard, or you are just having maybe a hard time getting back to normal after a ayahuasca session. Integration. Part of integration is nutrition. So be advised. So yeah, we really appreciate Entheozen as a sponsor here. Their TransZen product is wonderful. You should check it out. If you want to get free shipping, go to entheozen.com/PT for psychedelics today. It's a special offer for you listeners out there. So please do that. And again, because it's a supplement, US only, but lucky South Dakota folks, you can get it, I believe. So check it out. And if you have any questions, you want to hit us up, let us know. If you want to hear somebody else on the show, please email us, psychedelicstoday@gmail.com. If you want to help us out, support our sponsors, or leave us a review on Facebook or iTunes. We love it. Thank you all for listening, and can't wait to get you another show next week. Joe Moore signing off from Psychedelics Today. Bye.